HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Exit the Milkman by Charlotte Macleod. Read by John Mclain.
Chapter 1. "Hi, Pete. Walking the cat?" Professor Peter Shandy, internationally acclaimed monarch of the turnip fields, refrained with some difficulty from grinding his teeth. This was the 587th time since the halcyon day when the Shandys had acquired a frolicsome tabby kitten that Professor James Felster had asked Peter that same damn-fool question. Peter knew. He'd kept count. Time had passed. That beguiling scrap of feline femininity had become a gracious lady cat of exactly the right size to occupy a favorite chair or a friendly lap. She was charmingly turned out in elegant tabby stripes of gray, grayer and grayest, accented by a jabot and gloves of purest white. She'd been named after another dainty little lady, long gone but never forgotten. A brief visit from the present Jane Austen was considered a mark of honor by those neighbors who lived around the Crescent, all except Muriel Felster, Jim's wife, who hated cats on principle and didn't care much for people either. Jim himself had been one of Jane's earliest conquests. She had him well trained to pause at the street end of the Shandy's front walk long enough for her to climb his faded blue denim pant leg, poke her pink nose inside the baggy white jacket he always wore, and discover which of his regalia Jim would have festooned himself with for tonight's lodge meeting. Whatever it was, it would clank. Jim's regalia always clanked, even when Jane wasn't around to check him out. Although Jim Felster stood 6'5" in his milking boots, he was not the sort of man who got noticed in a crowd. His only claims to recognition were two. First, he was Balaclava Agricultural College's never-surpassed expert on the fundamentals of dairy management, a course that he'd taught with unflagging zeal for the past 37 years. Second, he knew more secret handshakes and esoteric passwords than any other dedicated lodge brother in Balaclava County. Maybe more than all the members of all the lodges in all the states put together. Maybe even in the entire galaxy, if those provocative theories which quantum physicists and authors of science fiction stories had been propounding for quite a while should happen to be true. As why should they not? Peter found such erudite speculations mildly interesting to muse upon, particularly when he happened to be wandering alone at eventide through the college's extensive turnip fields, as he sometimes did for no special reason. It would never have occurred to Jim Felster, he thought, that either quantum theory or turnips might be worth investigating. And why should they? Professor Felster knew more than anybody else about dairy management. He'd taken the trouble to learn a vast deal about mystic rights, and earned the right to clank all he wanted to at appropriate times and places. Those ought to be enough for any reasonable professor to think about. Jim did stop long enough to watch Jane wash her paws, paying scrupulous attention to each pussy willow toe. Cleanliness being among the most fundamental of fundamentals of dairy management, he honored her with a ritual pat between the ears, then clanked resolutely onward toward his secret rendezvous. Had Jane been a tomcat, Peter thought, Jim might by now have taught the intelligent creature a few secret paw shakes. Here in Balaclava County, however, fraternal organizations were still bucking the national trend toward androgyny, doing their utmost to keep their arcane doings fraternal, in the strict sense of the word. So far, the ladies of Balaclava County had shown no great inclination to storm the barricades. Helen Shandy's opinion was that they couldn't be bothered because they had better things to do. She was probably right. Helen was a librarian, and librarians always knew. Anyway, whatever the reason, Brother James Felster would have been the last of his fellows to proffer the handshake of personhood to any female intrepid enough to expect one. It was not that Professor Felster had any antipathy to females in general. Some of his best students were of the womanly persuasion, and he'd never met a cow he didn't like. His stubborn defense of the male Lodge brothers' last stronghold was based solely on a primal instinct toward self-preservation. Any man, even any woman, who'd ever spent 5 minutes in the company of Muriel Felster didn't need to be told why her husband joined so many lodges and never missed a meeting. Normally Jim would have been on his way to Charlie Ross's garage. He and Peter both parked their cars at Charlie's. Parking was all but impossible around the Crescent, where the Shandys, the Felsters, and a few other faculty families lived in houses that were owned by the college and rented out to the elect. Tonight, however, was Muriel Felster's bridge night. This meant that she would be using the Felster car herself. Jim must be expecting to be picked up along the way by some lodge brother. Peter didn't really give a hoot what either of the Felsters would be doing tonight, but anybody who lived around the Crescent couldn't help knowing every last thing that went on there. Willed he or nilled he, or she. And what the Crescent knew, every last soul in Balaclava Junction would get to know, because Muriel Felster would make sure in one way or another that they did. But not before she'd got the information twisted up, down and sideways, blown out of context, and repainted in the murkiest colors possible. Peter and Helen Shandy were among Muriel's special targets, though they lived circumspectly enough, never fought, didn't even raise their voices over a difference of opinion, gave no wild parties, kept their lawn mowed, and refrained from cutting down the magnificent blue spruce trees that had sheltered the small red brick house long before its present tenants had been born. Muriel had been loudly and chronically opposed to the Shandys touching so much as a twig, until at last it dawned upon her that neither of them would ever have dreamed of assaulting their cherished spruces. Thereupon she'd executed a smart right-about face, and started bemoaning the Shandys' perversity in leaving those great, messy, dangerous old trees just where they spoiled the Felsters' view. Had the trees been taken away, their ever-critical neighbor's only view would have been of the Shandys' bedroom windows, across which Peter and Helen were always careful to draw their curtains at bedtime. Muriel had a habit of ducking in under the spruces with her binoculars at the ready, and a glib tale of bat-watching on her lips, in case they happened to catch her snooping. The woman's chief problem seemed to be that she could find so little about the Shandys to revile, though she was always ready to do what she could with what she might find. Lately she'd taken it as a personal affront that Helen Marsh Shandy was getting so much cheap notoriety out of a stupid book she'd written about the Buggins family, who, Helen claimed, had founded not only the college, but all Balaclava County. As in fact they had, but that didn't cut any ice with Muriel. Not to mention the pack of lies she'd dreamed up about an old souse called Praxiteles Lumpkin, and his so-called weather vanes. Worst of all was the brazen way Helen Marsh had managed to snare herself a husband, practically the same day she'd set foot on campus. And look what she'd got for her trouble. Everybody knew Peter Shandy was crazy as a coot, and always had been. And thus it went. What Muriel might come out with at any time of day or night depended on the often faulty connection between her fevered brain and her forked tongue. What generally resulted was either a tempest in a teapot, or else just a fly in the flue. More often than not, neither Peter nor Helen was aware of their neighbor's one-sided vendetta. If they did happen to notice, they generally found the situation mildly amusing. Jim wasn't a bad old scout, though. Peter and he sometimes shared a table in the faculty dining room. Helen and Peter wouldn't have minded having Jim over to the house for a cup of coffee now and then, but that would have meant having to ask Muriel, too. Chance meetings on neutral ground were less of a risk. Tonight, Peter wished his neighbor a happy lodging, and accepted Jane Austen's suggestion that he and she take a little stroll around the Crescent. Strolling with Jane usually meant her human escorts waiting as patiently as could reasonably be expected, while she manicured her claws on a convenient tree trunk, or chased after a squirrel almost her own size, just to remind it which small, furry gray quadruped was running the show in this neighborhood. All things considered, Jane could be rated as no pushover, but an amiable Malkin, willing enough to accept any small courtesy, such as a gentle pat or a compliment on her fine stand of whiskers, but ready to retire to her favorite perch in the crook of Peter's elbow if a neighbor tried to pick her up. As they passed the Porble house, Phil Porble, the college librarian and Helen's nominal boss, remarked that Peter and Jane reminded him of Samuel Johnson and old Hodge going out to buy oysters. Peter replied that oysters must have been a damned sight cheaper then than they were now. Jane's thoughts, as cat's meditations generally do, remained her own. There was more than a hint of fall in the air tonight. Here in Balaclava County, the leaves were already beginning to turn. Students were moving their effects into the dormitories. Tomorrow morning, they'd be lining up to register for classes. Peter and his colleagues would be making last-minute changes in their schedules and giving the new lot of teaching assistants a final pep talk on how to keep a room full of first-year students awake long enough to capture their full and complete attention. Jane was tiring of her stroll. By the time she and Peter reached the Enderbles, who lived directly across the Crescent from the Shandies, she was up his pant leg and into his arms, yawning in that artless way young lady cats do, without bothering to cover her rose-petal mouth. Jane's yawn must have been catching. John Enderble, Professor Emeritus of Local Fauna, was following her example. "Hadn't you better go in, John?" That was his ever-solicitous wife, Mary, one of the few persons whom Jane would allow to pick her up. "You know you have to narrate that program the Ameses will be filming tomorrow about the cabbage butterfly." "Assuming we can find a butterfly, dear. And a cabbage." "Oh, John, you silly old goofus. Tell him to go to bed, Peter." Peter obliged. "Go to bed, John. You're a television star now, you know. Think of your public." Peter wasn't trying to be funny. Professor Emeritus John Enderble was cutting quite a figure these days. Already widely known as the author of Our Friends the Snakes, How to Live with the Burrowing Mammals, and several other books both delightful and informative, John was capturing a new audience via station WEED. Balaclava Agricultural College now had its own public broadcasting facility, focused exclusively on subjects of an environmental nature, and subsidized by Professor Winifred Binks Debenham, sole heiress to her late grandfather's immense fortune, and an even more reliable authority on the burrowing mammals than Professor Enderble, having been one herself for a period of several years. John was ready to exchange a few more pleasantries, but Jane, on a telepathic hint from Mary, broke up the meeting by leaping out of Peter's arms and racing for home. She made a quick stop behind a clump of coral bells in a new shade that Peter was trying out, tended meticulously to the tidying up process that she'd learned as a wee kitten in the Enderbles' sandbox, and emerged ready to quit for the night. Not so Peter. He could not resist going into the cubbyhole that he called his office to make a few more additions and corrections to his notes, knowing perfectly well as he did so that he'd forget them once he got on his feet before his first class, and just tell the students what they needed to know. And they'd listen, by gad. Professor Shandy's courses were stiff. His examinations were frequent. He marked harder than a slab of New England granite, yet his students never missed a class. After a while, Helen came down from her own office. Getting into it was a tight squeeze. All the rooms in the old brick house were small. The shandies themselves were no giants, however, and liked the place as it was. Helen suggested a pre-bedtime cup of chamomile tea. Peter offered an alternate suggestion. A few days ago, Winifred Binks Debenham had given them a jar of something purely organic made of elderberries, potato peelings, and no doubt a few more exotic odds and ends. Old habits died hard. Winifred had not been able to make herself disassemble the primitive, and most likely illegal still, that she'd rigged up from a banged-up stew kettle and a rusty tin funnel found in a burned-out cellar hole during her hobbit days. Winifred's potations were never twice the same, but always worth sampling. Tonight, Peter recognized a soupçon of elderberry. Helen detected a hint of chokecherry. They both got the essence of dandelion. It made a pleasant wind-up to a somewhat hectic day. Having performed their usual bedtime rituals behind drawn curtains, though with scant concern as to whether Muriel Felster might or might not be on the prowl, Peter and Helen gave themselves over to sweet conjugal repose. Jane strolled back and forth over their recumbent bodies a few times, selected a cozy spot in the bend of Helen's knees, spent a frantic minute or so washing her own left hind leg, purred her two humans a brief lullaby, and relaxed herself into that happy hunting ground where good cats go mousing in their dreams. Serenity reigned in the shandy's bedroom until precisely 2:47 a.m. by the illuminated clock on the nightstand. That was when all hell broke loose. Peter shot up like a startled woodcock, struggling to get his arms into his bathrobe. Helen switched on her reading lamp and dropped a quiet word to the effect that he might find his task less perplexing if he were to turn the robe right side up. As this seemed a reasonable suggestion, Peter tried again and succeeded. "All set. I'd better go see what the flaming perdition's going on down there. That's Muriel Felster's voice, isn't it? What's she screeching for?" "Who knows? You go downstairs, Peter. I'll be right along." Helen was not about to face her neighbor in nothing but a pink chiffon nightie. As the howling and thumping at their front door got louder and wilder, she ran a comb through her short blonde curls, dabbed on a bit of lip gloss, and slipped into a fairly dashing negligee that Peter had bought her for reasons of his own. She might as well give Muriel a chance to titillate her bridge buddies with a juicy nugget about the lewd lingerie of libertine librarians. Oddly enough, Muriel didn't even appear to notice Helen. She was totally caught up in her own tribulations, which Peter, by dint of some fancy yelling on his own part, managed to boil down to the simple statement that Jim hadn't come back from his lodge meeting. Muriel thought he might have stopped in to visit the shanties on his way home. Of all the blithering idiocy. Normally Peter Shandy was not the sort of man to get into a shouting match with a neighbor in the dead of night. Tonight, all Muriel's nasty digs, her bossiness, her pushiness, her damnable poking and prying and spreading false rumors, got rolled up into one scabrous wad. He let her have it right between the eyes. "Of course Jim isn't here. For God's sake, Muriel, did you have to wake up the whole Crescent? What do you think the neighbors are saying right now?" The question was redundant. Peter knew damned good and well what the neighbors must be saying, and he didn't blame them one iota. Muriel Felster's dramatic outbursts were no novelty, but this was the first time Peter could remember that she'd gone to such histrionic lengths. But then she might never before have had reason to, as far as he knew. Jim had never stayed out so late before. Sighing, Peter damped down his righteous indignation and assumed the role that had been forced upon him several years ago, as Balaclava's apology for Sherlock Holmes. "What time did you get home yourself, Muriel?" She had herself a little more under control now. She answered like a sulky child. "About 11:15. The rest of us wanted to keep on playing, but naturally Coralie had to get home to her answering machine. You know Coralie." Peter did know Coralie Melchett, and wished he didn't. Being the wife of the only doctor in town, who was also the college physician, mainly because his father and grandfather had held the position before him, and being also the daughter of the man who had established a small but highly regarded chain of ladies' clothing stores around the region, Coralie felt it her civic duty to dress up to her station and look down on her neighbors, except for a chosen few, of whom Muriel Felster was a leading light. Peter remained unawed. "So you've been sitting up all this time waiting for Jim?" That struck her in a sore spot. "Why should I? Jim never waits up for me. Not that I'm one to be running the roads, as well you know, but I do have to get out sometimes, don't I?" "That's beside the point. Look, Muriel, why don't we try talking sense for a change? I saw Jim walk past our house about 7 o'clock. He stopped a minute to pass the time of day and pat the cat. Then he walked on. I assumed then that he was going down to Charlie Ross's to get his car, but that can't have been the case. You'd already taken the car to your bridge club, hadn't you?" "It's my car as much as his. I believe I'm entitled to get a little use out of it once in a blue moon." Since it was well known around town that Muriel spent a good deal more time in the car than she did in her house, Peter didn't bother to answer that one. "Then I'm to assume," he said, "that Jim must have been meaning to get a lift from one of his lodge brothers. Would you happen to know which lodge he was going to last night?" "I can't keep track of the foolish things." Muriel spent a moment in silent glowering, then said grudgingly that it might have been those idiots who called themselves the Scarlet Runners. "They usually meet at the firehouse in Lumpkinton, though I can't see why Jim has to go traipsing all the way over there. They could just as well meet here at the Balaclava Junction firehouse, such as it is." "Except that there's barely enough room here to squeeze in the fire truck, much less hold a meeting. Furthermore, all the Scarlet Runners except Jim live in Lumpkinton, and their firehouse has a very comfortable meeting room, plus a special stall to park the old hose cart, which they take out on special occasions, as you very well know." Peter was warming up to the job. "If you'd only stopped to think, Muriel, it might have occurred to you that Elver Butts, who's one of Jim's lodge brothers, has been over here on campus with his helpers every day for the past couple of weeks, replacing the wiring in the farrowing barn. Since you were planning to take the car to your bridge game, Jim most likely hitched a ride with Elver, which would have got him to the meeting all right, but left him without a ride home. So the logical assumption would be that Butts has offered Jim a bed for the night and is planning to bring him back in the truck with the crew when they come to work. Which makes perfect sense all around, and I can't see what you've got yourself so damned head up about." Muriel was not placated. "That's right. Put the blame on me. Why couldn't Jim have phoned and let me know he'd be late?" "Perhaps he did, and you weren't around to take his call." "He could have called back later, couldn't he?" Peter was about ready to let off steam again. "Look, Muriel, you told me just now that you weren't in the habit of waiting up for Jim. So that must mean you went straight up to bed when you got in, slept for 2 or 3 hours, and woke because you drunk too much coffee at the bridge party. You got up to go to the bathroom, didn't hear Jim snoring." It was well known around the Crescent that the Feldsters occupied separate bedrooms, for whatever reasons they chose to give. "And went into a tizzy when you looked into his room and found he wasn't there." "I don't care," Muriel pouted. "He could still have called." "What would have been the sense? Jim knew you'd be out playing bridge all evening. He also knew it's a toll call from Lumpkinton to Balaclava Junction and didn't want to run up Butts's telephone bill. He wouldn't have tried to call you collect because he'd know damn well you'd refuse to accept his call out of spite." "So what I'm supposed to do now is go back home and worry myself sick all night, is that it?" "Actually, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, but I suppose you can get in a fair amount of agonizing between now and daylight if that's what tickles your fancy. Or you might make yourself a cup of chamomile tea and go back to bed like a sensible person. If you can't sleep, read a book. I'd escort you back home, but I don't suppose you'd particularly want the neighbors seeing us together with bare legs and bathrobes, so I'll just stay here on the stoop and wait to make sure the goblins don't grab you before you get safely inside." "Thanks for nothing. I ought to have known I wouldn't get any help from you, Peter Shandy." "And how right you'd have been. Good morning, Morel." If she'd been anybody less exasperating than Morel Feltster, Peter would have at least taken the time to phone the state police and find out whether any accident had been reported on the Balaclava to Lumpkinton Road that evening. He might even have got his own car from Charlie's and driven slowly with his high beams on over the route Elver Butts would most likely have taken, for whatever good that might have done. If Jim Feltster had been in any sort of accident, surely somebody would at least have made an attempt to reach his wife. Maybe this show that Morel had just put on stemmed from plain boredom. Maybe she'd been out on a tear with the mailman and was trying to cover up. Maybe she'd strangled Jim with his Scarlet Runner regalia, or just shoved him down the cellar stairs because she couldn't stand any more of his clanking. More probably, Jim had seen his chance to stay clear of Morel for a few extra hours and grabbed it, as any sensible man naturally would. The Feltsters' front door opened and closed. Morel had left the outside light on. The screech owl that had taken up residence in the tallest spruce tree said something rude about humans who didn't know enough to perch quietly in their own habitats during an owl's hunting hours. During the whole time, Helen had spoken no word nor made any sign. Seeing that the show was over, she scooped up Jane Austen, settled the little cat comfortably on her shoulder, and led the way back to bed. Chapter 2. "Were you dreaming last night, or was I?" Helen Shandy picked up the coffee pot and gave it a gentle slosh. "I think there's just about enough in here for one more cup. Want it?" "Let's each have half." Peter held out his cup. "To answer your question, I'm reasonably sure that I was awake. If I'd been in the mood to dream, I'd have picked somebody more interesting than Morel Feltster to dream about. That woman's a bigger nuisance than an epidemic of fire blight. I'd say she was batty, but I don't want to traduce the bat, which is a useful critter in its own quiet way." "And also cute," Helen added. "I do like those little round ears and pointy wings, and the way they flap around, going eek, eek, eek. And what would Halloween be without them?" "Good question," said Peter. "What's on your agenda today?" "Never you mind my agenda. What do you think we should do about Jim Feltster?" "Greet him politely when he comes home from the wars, I suppose." Helen sniffed. "Home to the wars will be more like it. All I can say is I'm glad I'll be able to barricade myself in the Buggins room all morning, rather than dodge the flying epithets. Would you like to rescue me sometime around noon and carry me off to the faculty dining room?" "Sure, cutie, my pleasure. I'll come to thee at noontide, though heck should bar the way. It isn't every denizen in the groves of Academe who gets to hang out with a gorgeous blonde who goes eek, eek, eek. Good gad, look at the time. I'd best be off to the greenhouses before the bush beans get rough with the Thunbergia. Au revoir, then, but not goodbye." What with one thing and another, Peter had no time to ponder the strange disappearance of Jim Feltster until he kept his luncheon date with Helen. She, of course, was primed with the goods. Librarians always got to know what was going on, even when they'd been pinned in all morning by 6 generations of the Buggins family. The gist of her morning's research was that Professor Feltster still hadn't shown his face anywhere around the cow barns, and chaos was rife in the animal husbandry department. The latest earth-shattering rumor was that the great Professor Daniel Stott, Sultan of Swine and Bashaw of Bulls, had actually consented to oversee Jim's classes himself, should a catastrophe have occurred and a reliable substitute not be found available. Professor Stott had even taken it upon himself to telephone Mrs. Feltster. all he'd got for his solicitude, had been a long diatribe, during which she'd switched like a runaway jumping bean from unbridled fury to
Sample complete. Ready to continue?